Greetings, lords and ladies. I wanted to talk about an interesting and relevant topic today, namely the return of characters that appeared in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. Now, I have a mixed opinion about this. Maybe some of it's a hot take, but I also want to express my appreciation for the fact that, yes, we will be meeting yet again Jaheira and Minsc and possibly some other characters. But I think it's important at the outset to state that although this is sort of good news, in general, I am a fan of stories being told to completion and then new stories being picked up consequently. I understand, however, in the context of Baldur's Gate, that Baldur's Gate 3 is a pretty big deal. We've waited some 23 years for this to arrive in many ways, and it would be somewhat odd not to include, if you think about it, somehow, some connection to the previous games, and indeed there will be. The very fact that Baal is involved is a necessary connection there, and a necessary condition for the game, one could argue. And Minsc's story, as well as Jaheira's, are relevant as well. They were key participants when Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 were going on, and I can understand how they fit into the story, broadly speaking. They have a history of dealing with things related to Baal, as it were. And Baal is one of the dead three. Again, very relevant. But I've seen a lot of people also wish that characters such as Viconia return, or Edwin, or take your pick. And although I'm not per se against that idea, the idea of simply shoehorning characters into the game just to have them there, just so they can reappear or make cameos, is not something that I'm a huge fan of, although I totally understand the sentiment behind it at the same time. And I also think that it's possible to weave some of these characters into the game without them appearing to be there superfluously or giving off the impression of having just been shoehorned into the game. And that can happen. For example, although the ultimate fate of Viconia is not clear depending on which ending she has, for example, if she had romanced the protagonist, then she is indeed slain by minions of Lolth, indeed poisoned to death. But as Wizards of the Coast is known for a lot of retcons, it would make sense on some level to have a Viconia appearance in the game. Why? Because she's a cleric of Shar. And Shar, as we know, will be playing a very major role, at the very, very least, with respect to Shadowheart. So, would it be totally shocking to see Viconia, who's a drow, very long lifespan, appear in Baldur's Gate 3? Perhaps in a cameo appearance, or as a major NPC? No, I think it would be entirely possible. Another character that might well make an appearance is Edwin, the Red Wizard of Thay. Although it would be harder to weave him into the story, I would argue, because as yet we don't have an overt connection to Thay, apart from the Necromancy of Thay, the tome, that book that I made an entire video about a while back. But my point is simply, it's not always easy to take these old characters and insert them into a new game. And the real question is whether or not it's actually worth it, whether or not it makes sense story-wise. I am almost 100% sure, for example, that Lorien has carefully thought out the plot of Minsc and Jaheira. I doubt they'll be romanceable, for example. Jaheira is an old woman by now, and Minsc is somewhat challenged, one could say. And as for the others, they would simply be NPCs, maybe making cameo appearances. And inasmuch as that makes sense, again, no issue with that. There are other characters that could appear too. Characters such as Drist or Elminster. And they might even make sense. But the fundamental issue here is oftentimes storytellers or companies' inability to let go of certain characters. The story of Drizzt is a good example of this, because many of the characters that originally appeared in the novels, say during the Icewind Dale trilogy or the Dark Elf trilogy, and related books that Drist appears in, have been resurrected. For example, Catti-brie, his friend and wife, and Regis the halfling rogue, and Wulfgar the human barbarian, and Wulfgar's adoptive father, Brunor. They were gone, they were dead, and for the sake of retconning and reasons that only Wizards of the Coast knows, they're back. And frankly speaking, I think it would have been much more interesting if Drizzt just had completely new adventures with new companions and what have you. And for that reason, I'm particularly glad that fundamentally Baldur's Gate 3 is about new characters. There's always that temptation to want to see the return of things that we're familiar with. We have a sense of nostalgia, and a lot of this is about nostalgia. It's a nostalgic feeling to see Minsc, for example, or even Jaheira, and by the gods, even to have them in our party, although that will be for a later playthrough for me, because I'm going to prioritize the origin characters first in terms of my playthrough. But I do think it's okay for a story to be told to its end, and for the character to not reappear necessarily. With the caveat, as mentioned, that if you are going to insert this character again into a game, then make it make sense. And to be perfectly honest, in terms of the characters that were in the original Baldur's Gate games, the only one that could really make sense in terms of the plot, in my humble opinion, are Viconia, the Drow cleric of Shar, because of their connection to Shar, and the relevance of Shar to the plot of Baldur's Gate 3, and maybe potentially Edwin, the Red Wizard of Thay, as well. Now, theoretically, and I say emphatically theoretically, because all the Baalspawn are technically dead, I could envision Imoen making some kind of appearance. Maybe they try to sneak in Imoen as the last quote-unquote Baalspawn, although again, technically the last Baalspawn died, and she might have a whole lot to say in her old age, because basically when you're a Baalspawn as a human, you get an extended lifespan. You get to live something like up to 200 years, something along those lines. So Imoen might be much wiser now. She might be, who knows, even an archmage. Remember, she transitions from a thief into a mage in Baldur's Gate 2, and she might have a lot to say, theoretically, about the plot, but that would be a very, very long shot indeed, and I just couldn't imagine her actually appearing that way. And all the other characters just don't really fit. They just are not as important, whether it's Aerie, whether it's the tiefling Hair Delise, Keldorn is dead, we know that, for example, the Paladin, the Inquisitor. Maybe Korgan Bloodaxe is still alive, the Dwarf Berserker, but they're just not really important story-wise. So, of the ones I mentioned, I would say Viconia is the most likely, followed by Edwin, and possibly followed by some kind of retcon version of Imoen, maybe as an archmage or wise old woman who still happens to be a Baalspawn and we just didn't know it. But ultimately, I'm curious as to what you think, guys, because I've expressed my opinion. I'm generally not opposed to this idea, but I like the idea of stories being told to their end and moving on to new stories, although we'll see what happens with Minsc and Jaheira. But if you have different ideas, different opinions, I'd love to see them in the comment section. So let me know, go wild. And as always, thank you for tuning in. And if you could leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel, it'd be much appreciated. It helps the channel out a lot. I'll check you out next time. Until then, take care.